Okay, welcome back. This is going to be the second half of Lecture 3 from Unit 1. So we're still talking about nationalism and moving from like the 40s to the 60s, basically. And so we're gonna talk about Gamal Abdel Nasser. There was basically a monarchy in many ways, sort of led by the Brits in Egypt. Israel claims independence in 1948, which is largely known around the region as Nakba. Um, and shortly thereafter, numerous Arab states attack Israel. And this is called the Arab-Israel War 1948. You've got Israel on one side and Egypt, who then controlled sort of the Palestinian area and Sinai. You've got what's at the time called Transjordan, Syria, and then Iraq sends a small little expeditionary force. The Arab states get their butts whooped, and whooped pretty hard, right? And not only do they get whipped, but they lose a bunch of land. Um, Israel gains more territory than they had before the war, and so it doesn't go very well. It's a huge embarrassment for the states that were involved, right? Egypt, Transjordan, etc., but also for sort of the Pan-Arab movement and the monarchy in Egypt, and people are sort of growing frustrated. And you see mass overturn of states during this time, from sort of monarchism to a lot of military dictatorships, some democratic projects, though they didn't all end very well. Anyway, okay. The Egyptian society, sort of post-war, wants revolution, right? They want to get rid of the feudal monarchy. They want militarism, right? They just saw themselves get their butt whooped. They're supposed to be one of sort of the leading states in all of the African continent. They have very important strategic positioning with the Suez Canal, the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, all of these sorts of things, right? And they have, I mean, just massive cultural history going back 3,000 years or so, right? Probably for way further than that, even. Um, and so the population is sort of clamoring for strength, right? And not only military strength, but also some military industrial sort of manufacturing, employment. There are problems with labor markets and these sorts of things, right? They haven't really kept up with the Industrial Revolution in Egypt and many of these areas. Finally, the people are sort of pushing for Arab unity. And the two targets for the most part are the Brits and the Israelis, right? These are sort of the rallying cries around which many of these leaders at the time are talking about how we should approach international diplomacy and what do we do about Palestine and Israel and all of these sorts of things. Gamal Abdel Nasser steps in the mid 1950s. He's pretty, I don't know if I would say laid back, but middle class, right? Sort of a common man instead of somebody from royalty. He's very popular and pretty charismatic. I've seen some of his speeches before, and people are clamoring for this dude. And he builds a bit of a cult of personality, which, in the long run, in many senses, sort of holds Anwar Sadat back, who takes over after Nasser dies, or after Nasser leaves, and then shortly thereafter dies, I think. The six main actors sort of leading to collapse in Egypt, at least of the monarchical situation and the British and what's going to come after, right? So really you have the Egyptian royals, right, and King Farouk. You've got the British, who have military, cultural, strategic, all kinds of interests in the area, right? You've got what's called the Wafd Party, which is basically like representing I don't know, the bourgeoisie, um, the industrialists and the bankers and these sorts of things. They become known as the Blue Shirts. And then you have sort of two populist nationalist groups, political parties, something like that, right? Organizations sort of coalescing. The first is the Muslim Brotherhood. They're calling for independence from the UK, in many ways deeply rooted in sort of Islam and traditional Sharia and these sorts of things. And they're also calling for the demise of Western influence and a greater influence of Islam and a different idea of a state and society and social mores and all of that. The other group among the sort of populist nationalist umbrella is the Young Egypt Society. They are purported fascists, right? They're following sort of Mussolini and others. They come to be known as the Green Shirts, and they're largely faculty from Cairo University Law School, which is kind of weird. I can't imagine my law school factory or my grad school faculty like going out and fighting corporatists in the street. It's very strange. Maybe they should. I don't know. Okay. Um, Okay, the final piece is the military. The military had just been really severely embarrassed, um, but it's a strength of the Egyptian society. It's where Nasser actually comes from. Eventually, Nasser is rising in the ranks and becomes a professor at the local military college. I guess sort of like the Air Force College or whatever in the United States. But he sort of creates this secret cabal called the Free Officers of especially junior officers who aren't necessarily highly linked to the monarchy, right? And they have three goals: overthrow the monarchy, force the British exit, and build their military strength, right? Which align well with pretty much both Muslim Brotherhood and the Young Egypt Society. Though they take two very different approaches, right? Okay. There's a military coup in 1952. So again, I mean, there's just shame and humiliation roiling in the political scene. The Brits are just sort of publicly humiliating the monarch Farouk. Um, Farouk is overthrown in 1952, and they create what's called the Revolutionary Command Council, the RCC. Nasser, a couple of years later, eventually overthrows Egypt's first prime minister, right? And becomes sort of president for near life in 1956. He cracked down a lot on opposition, and he tended to put sort of weak people around him who wouldn't be able to necessarily overthrow him in a coup. This is always in the back of the mind of a dictator. And you get an assassination attempt in 1954, which helps to really popularize um, Nasser. Populism was the word of the game for Nasser's nationalism. A little bit different from Pahlavi and Kemal Ataturk. He's very much a man of the people. Um, he became wealthier, but he didn't sort of exhibit the extraordinary wealth or ostentatiousness of like Pahlavi, right? He used really strong, simple language and messages. He was really good in public speaking opportunities and the propaganda game, things like that. He was seen to have strength in foreign policy, though that would collapse later in his career. And he brought about sort of social changes and an entire socialist project. Um, they didn't really necessarily move toward democracy or capitalism, and they had just ejected monarchism. And so he brought in this socialist program, a lot of state spending on the military and infrastructure, including the Aswan Dam, programs to sort of end hunger and help farmers in the Nile region, these sorts of things. But he didn't really turn toward full socialism until the 60s or so, like the early 60s. Nasser was also very strongly pro-Arab and pro-Egypt. I think Egypt first and then pro-Arab. And this is pretty different than many of his surrounding contemporaries who led other states in the Middle Eastern project, who oftentimes sort of bowed to either British or US pressure. But Nasser was like strongly, staunchly, and openly against all of that, right? He saw it as exploitation and sort of neo-colonialism and these sorts of things. Then we get the Suez Canal crisis in 1956. The US and the UK had promised to offer some aid to help finance the Aswan Dam in return for further assistance with like the Suez Canal and things like that. And Nasser went out and publicly announced it, and then the US and the UK withdrew their assistance, right? And it seems to have really pissed off Nasser. And there's two ways of seeing this, right? The Egyptian perspective is they nationalized the assets, right? The Suez Canal and the Suez Canal Company were on Egyptian territory and were sort of gaining where Egyptians should be gaining, right? Instead of external forces. The West would call it expropriation, right? You took our assets and did not offer recompense, and it also had strategic and military implications and trade implications, right? Because they sort of now are saying we control the canal and all sorts of stuff, right? And so this is not going very well. Eventually, the Soviets actually step in and replace much of the money that the UK and the US had promised, and so that adds further tension, right? Because the Cold War is really starting to sort of kick off around this period, um, and you're starting to see a lot of sort of proxy states aligning with one side or the other, right? At this point, Israel invades Egypt, and the British and the French also sort of invade Egypt, right? The British and the French like called for a ceasefire, and the very next day landed troops in Egypt. And the U.S. steps in basically and says like everybody needs to back the hell off. They force Europe, Britain, and France to back off. Egypt is embarrassed again, right? They just got whipped again. They had just been crushed by the Israelis in 1948, and now in 1956 they try to make a major international move and get beat on basically, and it's another embarrassment, right? And Israel takes the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip and basically takes control of the Suez Canal for a while. And at this point, Nasser cracks down internally and really starts a pretty heavy repression campaign and turns towards sort of pan-Arabism and the tearing down of Arab borders to try and sort of, I guess, wag the dog, right? Get attention off of this humiliating loss. All right. We'll come back to Nasser in the final chapter. Okay. Nationalism in the Maghreb is the final little section. I don't know a whole lot about this history. I'm just going to kind of touch on it a little bit. When we talk about the Middle East, we don't generally sort of lump in most of these Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, etc. But I'll cover a little bit of it because it is important, and French colonialism was just absolutely horrifyingly brutal. And actually, one of the readings from the political philosophy course from this spring is from Frantz Fanon, who lived under the Algerian colonial campaign, right? And it really radicalized him. Okay. So we're also seeing a shift toward anti-colonialism. Much of the Mideast wasn't really colonized in a sense, right? They were like protectorates or mandates or these sorts of things. But in a lot of ways, there was self-governance and that sort of stuff. But the French took a different approach. They tried to control most of North Africa because of, the proximity to France and these sorts of things. Libya, for a little while, was a colony of Italy. Morocco and Tunisia become independent in 1956, and the French basically just want to focus on Algeria, right? And you get really brutal repression campaigns. There end up being more than 1 million dead in the last decade or so, and about 2 million in concentration camps or resettlement camps. There was a lot of sort of subhumanization of the Algerians, right? There used to be a lot of talk about sort of savages and tribal and, all of this kind of stuff, and that they're not uh, modern or civilized, quote unquote, these sorts of ideas, right? And the crazy thing is that like, France had been fighting the Germans. I mean, what 10 years before that, because of some of the problems with Vichy France and the atrocities of Hitler against the Jewish people and Romani and others. But they're sort of carrying out this same philosophy against the Algerians. They also not only sort of tried to subhumanize them, right, and quote unquote civilize them, but this also meant like tearing down their culture as quote unquote savage, sort of humiliating people in front of their community and their families, and tearing down their traditions and these sorts of things. So it was a pretty rough campaign. Algeria finally gains independence in 1962. There's no really overarching leader, and they still struggle with things like corruption and human rights and free speech and journalism, these sorts of things. They still imprison a lot of sort of political figures and dissidents, etc. All right, that's all I've got for you for this chapter. I will get chapter 4 up next, which is a little shorter than this one. And then finally, I'm going to put up my supplemental, at least for this time period. And then I'm going to add another supplemental in the next section. All right. Thanks so much for being here. Have a great day.